And welcome back to Alien Addictions. I'm your host, AlienPhotog, and we're joined here with Clif High, the creator of the WebBot. I'm real excited to do this interview with Clif. I've been following what you've been doing with the WebBot for a couple of years here. How are you doing today?
I'm doing just fine. I'm very cold, but I've got warm dogs and warm coffee, so I'm set.
I hear you too. It's been like San Diego here in the Denver area until last week, and then we hit 5 below. So that
Well, it's been very unusual for us with all of the extended cold, but I kind of had a feeling it was going to replicate 1990 because of the Pacific Decadal Oscillation.
Right.
And in 1990, we had 11 days that were 17 degrees or lower, so unusual for us. All the ponds are frozen, the ice crystals are forming on everything, and it's actually dry, which is sort of great.
Well, and you're up in the Washington area, is that correct?
I'm in Olympia, at the very southern edge of southernmost point of Puget Sound, what we like to call the Great Pacific Northwest Riviera. Because it does not resemble the Riviera at all.
Just like Mexico, except a lot colder and no white sand.
And no topless beaches,
Oh,
a
man.
lot of big trees, and eagles that drop half-eaten salmon on your head, that kind of thing.
Hey, I've got my tickets booked. It sounds great. Oh, man. Well, thanks again for joining us. I sure appreciate it. I guess why don't we start off with, I've explained it a little bit, but why don't you go into some detail about how the WebBot works, a little, in a brief history of it.
Okay, I'll leave you the task of saying when enough is enough. So
Okay.
you'll decide what's brief, and I'll just start in on it, okay?
Great.
I had a very peculiar upbringing, which led me to go into software, which is not anything I would ever advise to anyone. But it did okay for me, and I had this particular idea when I was working for a very large software company that will remain nameless for their consulting branch. And one of their clients had a giant, massive storage problem. And this is way back when storage was expensive. Hard disk space was expensive in the grand scheme of things.
Right.
And so we had to be very efficient in storing quite actually groups of thousands of millions of records, and it was quite tedious. And they actually had a situation that in the industry is called an operational failure. And this was back in the early days when we were just starting to automate things with software through the 80s and into the early 90s. And you could frequently invest hundreds of thousands of dollars, perhaps millions of dollars, and lots of man hours into a project that made sense all the way along. It went through all of its tests, but when everything was assembled and compiled and put together to go and actually do work, it would fail for one reason or another. I mean, it would operate, but it wouldn't deliver the goods. And they had a particular situation where they had a massive project that they could do a select statement on. Underneath it all was this stuff called SQL Server, which is a standard query language or structured query language database. And Microsoft's SQL Server was being used as well as the Sybase one. So it wasn't really an issue of performance based on platform or anything. It was just the limitations of the software per se. And they had hundreds or thousands of millions of records. So when the average user went to hunt for something, they'd put in a request and it might start spitting out answers, in this case, actually a week later. So that obviously didn't do this business that much good when they were hoping for, virtually instantaneous. And it was because of how the records were stored and the complex joins and unions and conjunctions they had to do in SQL Server to get the data out. Anyway, it made me start thinking about how humans deal with the storage of data, not only on disks, but also in their own head. There was this interesting science fiction series, and I can't think of the guy's name at the moment. Maybe it was Heinlein, but it was Time Enough for Love was one of the books, and there was this recurring character, Lazarus Long, who was a long-lived human. And one of the things that he pondered in the course of these many, I think there were probably 2 or 3 books that featured him, was how does a human maintain an accurate storage of their memory and keep all their memory and stuff sorted appropriately when they live to be 700-800 years old. And it's a real issue. And in any event, and considering all of that, I started thinking about language. And once you really start thinking about things, that is to do what I call gnawing on universe, where you throw out, and that's actually a technique. I have humorously named it that way, but there was this technique of thinking that was derived initially in the Greeks, but sort of perfected in early Roman times, where they would examine the nature of the reality around them And one of the techniques was to pitch out all of your own assumptions and root out and see what assumptions you have that are blinding you to potential
I
solutions.
love it.
Okay, and frequently that's how we find things, by the way. You know, the anecdotal story of the Edison, taking the 20-minute naps all the time. Well, he would do this in order to clear his mind and get a fresh approach and to essentially allow sort of a little reboot. And so, returning to the story here, I started getting rid of assumptions and getting rid of assumptions until all I was left with was essentially humans and their relationship to language. And I came up with a solution for the company, and they didn't implement it as I designed it, but they took my what I called U-turn SQL statements, and they had a situation. I'll tell you very briefly. They had a situation where within their SQL server, at one point, they had 5,000 and 6,000 permanent tables and another 20 or 30,000 temporary tables that were being created and dropped all the time. And that's really where the whole system was bogging down, was in the overhead of creating all the tables. So what I did was to give them a fixed 7 table solution. And what I actually ended up doing was shifting the complexity out of the table structure into the SQL statements, into the SQL statements. And so then they had the issue of having to train their support techs in writing these complex SQL statements that might run on 5 and 6 and 7,000 instructions, but they were blindingly fast. They would take the same 10 or 20 million records that were going to come back to you a week later if you asked it in standard SQL, which is, select this from there where the following is true or false. And in my case, it would be, I won't go into the details of it because it's far too complex, but in any event, mine would start returning the same data instantly. It would take the same time to spew it back to you. If you got 10 million records, it takes a long time to bring those back, but mine would start, a week ahead of the competition, so to speak. So that was good, and they implemented some of that. But it got me thinking about language, and that's when I really started investigating language because although I used it as a tool, was familiar with it, liked it, and it was good stuff, I'd never ever really sat down and thought about it and studied it. And when you get into studying something as complex, but also as core as language, it leads you to all kinds of interesting thoughts, or at least it did in my case. And one of the things I noticed was that humans don't use the language that they have internalized. Your mama sits you down over the course of your first 11 or 12 years and exposes you to all kinds of language, and you internalize a lot of the words. And then from the time there's predictable language learning periods in your life, by the way. You have
Right.
this burst that goes until about 8 years old. There's another resurgence at 11. There's another one at about 16 that lasts for about 5 or 6 months. And then you go sort of dormant on language learning until your mid 20s, and basically you drop out of puberty. And so from about 26 until 30, there's a really good opportunity to just suck down all kinds of knowledge because you're no longer hormonally bound in terms of how your brain functions. And then there's a marvelous time again in your late 40s through, we think, until about 70 or so. In any event, though, I started thinking about language and found some interesting facts. No matter what the language, given the appropriate opportunity, most people, let's just say in the developed world, most individuals in the developed world, no matter what their native language, will be exposed to about 100,000 words by the time they reach this 30-year-old threshold. And they may have internalized 100,000 words where they may be uncomfortable using them for a bunch of different reasons, but nonetheless, they really kind of think they know what they mean. And that group of words forms your tool chest. And they're marvelous tools, and essentially they're all equal, or so I thought. And that turns out to be not the case. Most of the language that we actually use falls into a very small category of words. In some places, in like highly structured in occupations like an accountant or an actuary or something, these poor guys find themselves in their work life maybe using less than 6,000 words in any given week, and it may actually even be a core of about 1,100 words.
Hmm.
And so it's somewhat limiting on their mind. The standard average, though, is assumed to be 20,000 words form your core vocabulary, your core lexicon, and in any given week, you'll probably use a subset of that that's less than 11,000. And I found that in my analysis to be mainly true. Now, bear in mind, this was happening in the early 90s, and the internet was really taking off then. And around 93 or so, I had this particular idea where I was kind of trying to discover why certain anomalies appeared to show up in the way humans use their